I usually introduce myself at these things by saying I'm the director of the IFS, but I think in this circumstance I should say I'm the current director of the IFS, given that this is our 50th anniversary year, and I just happen to be lucky enough to be in place whilst we're going to be celebrating that 50th anniversary. So welcome here to the Royal Institution. This is not a place that we've been to before, and not typical of the sorts of places that we're at. I remember this as a child watching on television. There used to be scientists on stage making bangs and blowing things up. We're going to be exciting tonight, but we're not going to be blowing anything up, I hope. This is the first of a series of events we're holding this year. We're looking at working age benefits this evening. The next event in April will be looking at tax. Then we've got something on retirement incomes, education, and then the even broader issue of the future shape and role of the state. So we've got 5 events like this through the year, as well as a big party in May. And it's quite a big year for us for other reasons. We're also going to be launching, I think, the biggest piece of work that we'll have done in our whole 50 years in May, the review of inequality, which is going to be chaired by Sir Angus Deaton. So that's a 4 or 5 year project which we're launching this year. So this, our 50th anniversary year, is proving to be a very big one for us. You'll see up there it says 1969 to 2019. We're hoping it goes beyond 2019 in terms of our world-class research and policy impact. The IFS was born as a very small thing, 4 founding members, or 4 founders, one of whom I'm delighted to say is in the audience today, 50 years on, set up at the end of the 1960s, specifically at that time to look at tax policy and tax policy making. We've expanded since then to look at really the economics of public policy, working across a range of issues. I'm delighted this evening that you're all here, and we've got this fantastic panel behind me. The way that this evening is going to work is that my colleague Joyce will introduce the issue, talking for about 20 minutes. Then I will spend 20 or 30 minutes sort of talking with the panel here about some of the issues that Rob's going to raise. I won't introduce the panel in any great detail. You'll know all of them. Lord Freud, who is the Benefits Welfare Reform Minister, Sir John Hills. In all of these events, we're hoping to have at least one IFS alumnus, and John is our token alumnus for this evening. He worked at the IFS back in the early 1980s. And Liz Sayce, a member of the Social Security Advisory Committee, and a particularly expert in disability benefits. So we're going to have that conversation on the panel. I will, as it were, be Fiona Bruce, and then we will open it up to you in the audience to ask questions of the panel. We'll finish by 8 o'clock, and there'll be drinks just down the passageway. I should say this is being filmed and live streamed, so all of you will be recorded, and if you ask questions, those will also be recorded. And thankfully, we don't have a meaningful or indeed meaningless vote tonight, so you can you can focus on the events at hand. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Rob, who will spend 20 minutes or so really introducing some of the challenges that we face in this huge thing, this £100 billion that we spend on working age benefits.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, as Paul has just said, we're talking about a system tonight that we currently spend around about £100 billion per year on as a country, which, to put that in context, is more than we spend on all of our education. It's more than we spend on all of our national defence and police force combined. So it's a huge part of what the government does. It's a huge part of our attempts to contain what would otherwise be many cases of very severe poverty. So there's at any one point in time around 2 million households who get pretty much all of their income from this source. But actually the reach of the system and its importance goes far wider than that. If we take universal credit, which is obviously the major reform in this area at the moment, the one everyone's talking about, well, around 1 in 3 of all working age households are expected to be getting some universal credit once that's fully rolled out. And actually, I think even that, in some ways, in some important ways, underplays the true breadth of this system, because it's a system which many, many people at some point in their life will get support from. In fact, we've done some work showing that most people will at some point receive a working age benefit. So it's a system that doesn't just support an unchanging minority of the population, it supports actually most of us at some point in our life, whether it's when we have children or ill health or have a temporary period of low income or a period of high housing costs or whatever it is. And actually, this is still true if we exclude things like child benefit, which have traditionally been universal, and if we focus only on the traditionally means-tested income-related benefits. More than 50% of people will at some point be in a household that gets one. So that's a rough sense of just how important all of this is. Of course, it's got a lot bigger over time. We haven't always spent £100 billion on it. This shows you that. If you, other than the recent period since the peak after the recession, you can see that spending on working age benefits has been on a pretty much continuous upward trajectory for decades. And actually, overall, in real terms, we're spending at the moment more than 3 times as much as we were back in the late 70s. Obviously, we're richer as a country. We have more income to spend than we did back then. But even as a proportion of national income, we're spending almost twice as much as we were back then as a proportion of all of our income. Now, as we've massively grown this system, we've also really reshaped it. And I think this is quite an important aspect in which that's true. I'm splitting that real terms rise in spending over time into 3 broad components. Means-tested payments, which are the ones that you get in light of having a low enough income at the particular point when you're assessed. Contributory payments, which you get in light of having made contributions in some way into the system in the past. And then other payments, these are essentially ones that you can get irrespective of your current income or past contributions if you satisfy some other condition, like in the case of the traditionally universal child benefit or the so-called extra costs disability benefit. And what you can see here is that the rise of the welfare state for those of working age is mostly about the rise of means testing. So we've got to a situation now where more than a clear majority, 60% of all of this spending goes on means tested benefits, whereas just a few decades ago it was a very small minority of the system. But one of the reasons why I like to show this chart at the outset actually is not just because it gives you a good sense of how we've got to where we are, but actually it immediately brings up all of the core trade-offs and tensions that we've been grappling with in this policy area for decades and will continue to do so because they're unavoidable. So you take the means-tested elements of the system. These have the advantage that you can target support on those who seem to need it most at any point in time and contain the cost in that way. And clearly, evidently from this picture, we've often found that a pretty irresistible argument. When we've wanted to, for example, reduce child poverty quickly, means testing has been a very convenient way of doing that in a way that limits the cost and ensures that we can expand into entitlements to a broad set of families, irrespective of whether they've previously contributed to the system, for example. But other countries have made different choices there. They have a different balance between these elements, and that's because there are trade-offs. Means-tested payments have downsides. A key one, of course, is that you have to withdraw support from people as their resources rise, and that can create some perverse incentives for decisions around working and saving and some other things. You avoid those downsides with contributory payments, and there are some other upsides, like perhaps getting people to feel more bought into the system, making explicit that link between what people are paying in one period and getting out in another period when they're in harder times. But they have the obvious downside that you can't then focus support on groups who you think are in need unless they've made contributions to the system in the past. And the other payments, well, they avoid those problems, but they mean that you can't channel resources in some of the more fine-tuned ways that the other 2 forms of support allow you to do. So there are trade-offs all over the place here, and I think even just looking at this chart brings many of them to mind. And of course, these are trade-offs that we at IFS, along with many others around the world, have been grappling with for a long, long time. An absolutely core example of this for our work would be trying to figure out how we can play clever tricks with policy to maximize the upsides and minimize the downsides when thinking about the effects of incentives. Where do incentives matter most? Who responds most to them? Where do they matter least? Who responds least to them? Where do we least need to worry about those incentives? And so I'm bringing up here some of the countless examples of IFS research on how people respond to incentives when making decisions about work. And this is part of a vast international literature on the topic. And my point here really is that we've learned a lot from this. We've learned things like single parents tend to respond quite a lot to incentives relative to other groups, so that's a group worth worrying about when we're thinking about financial incentives. And facts like that have helped us to design policy a little bit better. They've certainly informed the design of our tax credit system. But all of this research starts from the acknowledgement that there are some core trade-offs here, and all we can try and do is manage them as best we can. You can't get rid of them. And of course, often in popular and political debate, that tends to get lost. It tends to sound like there are easy answers when there aren't. So I think it would be a dereliction of duty for me not to point that out somewhere towards the beginning of this evening, because actually some of these core tensions are going to be at the heart of any discussion like this that is had at any point in history. But I want to move on to use the rest of my short time here, perhaps to help more directly stimulate some of the discussion we might have afterwards, which is and I want to pick out 3 big areas of challenge that I see for working age benefits going forward. And of course, the thing on everyone's mind probably is universal credit. I could easily be talking about some of the challenges that that's trying to address, the lack of integration, the complex patchwork of a system we have. And I could also easily talk about all of the challenges that we're clearly having implementing universal credit. And I suspect we will talk about that afterwards. And actually, partly for that reason, I want to zoom out a little bit more and think, I would argue, somewhat bigger picture. There are some underlying challenges which affected the system that universal credit is replacing, and they will carry on affecting the system under universal credit, even if universal credit goes perfectly from here on in. So I want to talk about those. Essentially, this is about what the benefit system does about 3 overlapping groups of people that I'm going to pick out. Of course, this isn't exhaustive. People who are in work but not earning very much, people who need support for the cost of their housing, and people with an incapacity or a disability. So I want to spend the rest of my short time talking briefly through each of these. Let's take the first one. So this shows you what proportion of our working age benefits bill is going to households where at least one adult is in paid work over time. I'm going to start this in the mid-1990s. And essentially, it's gone up a lot, from a minority back then of 40% to a clear majority of almost 60% now. So that's a big change. Now, in large part, this does just reflect the wider change in the nature of who is poor in the UK. We have a benefit system that's trying to focus resources on those who need it most, and more of those towards the bottom of our income distribution now are in paid work than was in the past. So let me just show you that explicitly. This shows you back in the mid-90s, if you take the population who were in poverty and in a working age household, that just over half of those were in a workless household. So poverty then was primarily a question of worklessness for the working age population. If we wind that forward to today, that's fallen to a third. Most of this poverty is among people in a household where at least one adult is in paid work. So why is this? This is partly due to some very good news. Part of a major reason why that green segment has got much smaller is because there are many fewer workless households. And we do have good evidence that actually benefits policy can take some of the credit for that. And at least there are at least a couple of good examples of that. One would be the tax credit system, which in large part due to work at the IFS, we know seems to have been successful in moving some groups into work who wouldn't otherwise have been there, particularly single parents. But it's not just because of that. One of the reasons why that orange segment has grown so rapidly is because amongst those who are in work, as we all know by now, pay growth has been so poor, particularly at the bottom end. And we've actually been increasingly using in-work cash transfers as a way of trying to plug that gap left behind by a lack of pay growth. Let me just show you that point explicitly now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take everyone who is in a household where at least one adult is in paid work. I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to do that 20 years ago. And I'm going to look at what's happened across the distribution to earnings and incomes. So to explain, if I bring up the first line, what this is essentially telling you is that if you look at household earnings only, before taxes and before benefits, and you look towards the top of the distribution at the 95th percentile, what you find is that household earnings there are about 40% higher after adjusting for inflation than they were 20 years ago for otherwise similar households back then. If you look towards the bottom, you see almost no change in the amount that is being earned. And the key point I want you to now take away is if you contrast that very steep slope you see here, essentially clearly increasing earnings inequality, with what you see if we instead look at total income after taxes, but including, importantly, cash transfers. What you see then is basically a flat line. The difference is mostly because of the expansion of tax credits and slightly more generally in-work cash transfers, which have topped up the earnings of low-earning households over this period. So you might think, well, given that we've got an increase in earnings inequality, which we've had, that's clearly a deeper problem. But given that, the benefit system has done all it can here. We should see this as a triumph because we've remarkably contained what would otherwise have been quite a significant increase in inequality. At a considerable cost, of course, and one has to wonder whether that would continue to be sustainable indefinitely if earnings inequality increases. But nevertheless, it's in some ways a remarkable achievement. So what's the challenge for benefits policy exactly here? So I would take you back to tax credits. Originally, when we brought tax credits in, I think there were three broad positive effects that we hoped for and perhaps expected. One was to increase employment amongst certain groups, and there's good evidence that we succeeded. One was to top up the incomes of those not earning much to a more acceptable level, and this graph suggests clearly that it's done that. But there was another, perhaps more profound effect that we thought might materialize, which was that by building up people's attachment to the labour market, getting some people to spend more time in work, particularly during the parenting years perhaps, they would end up with more experience and their careers would progress. Work was a stepping stone. We'd get them into work and from there we could address low pay because they'd build up more experience and attachment and we'd see wage growth. In other words, what was hoped is that tax credits could perhaps not just plug the gap between these two lines, but might actually play a role in raising the bottom line up in the long term. And what we've increasingly learned is that that doesn't seem to happen. Essentially, over the last 20 years or so, we've increasingly been able to see, partly because we've got better data that allows us to look at this, that towards the bottom end of the labour market, people can spend a lot of time in paid work and still see no progression. They don't see the kind of progression that groups on higher wages and higher levels of education will tend to see when they're in work. And so actually the stepping stone story doesn't seem to have materialized very much at all. What happens is you move people into work, that may well be better than what we had before, but they don't then take off. They stay on low pay and often on tax credits. So one challenge for the benefit system is there anything that it can do to improve that particular situation? With universal credit, we're trying. There are various trials going on right now that are essentially extending both what we require of working claimants of universal credit in terms of looking for higher paid work or taking steps to do that, and the kind of help that can be available for them in doing that. We don't yet know whether that's going to have the intended effects or not, or whether it will have some unintended effects. That's clearly one key issue. Another one would be part-time work. A lot of the work that we've done recently looking at the gender pay gap has shown that pay progression in part-time work is particularly bad. Often our benefit system actually structures incentives to encourage part-time work. So one open but I think very relevant question is, have we got the balance right there, given that we know that that kind of work is particularly bad for progression? And is there anything else that our benefit system can do as part of what clearly needs to be a much wider assault on low pay and low pay progression? So I think that's the first broad area of real challenge for the system that I would raise. Challenge 2 is support for housing costs. So this shows you what's happened to real spending on housing benefit over the last 20 years or so. And it's quite incredible that it's more than doubled. So we are spending far, far more than we were even a short time ago. This is for a number of reasons that are putting upward pressure on the housing benefit bill. A key one, particularly in the more recent years, is the huge growth in the size of the relatively high rent private rented sector as home ownership falls and also cheaper social housing is in decline. So this leaves benefits policy with a pretty unpalatable dilemma given these huge underlying upward pressures on housing costs. It either has to continue to foot the extra bill for that, or it has to allow, in some cases, pretty low income and potentially vulnerable households to foot more of the bill. And what we've started to do more recently is move towards the latter approach. And you can actually see in recent years spending coming down. That's going to be partly because of wider economic trends, but there's a key role here for a change in policy. What we've basically done is broken the link between support for housing costs and the actual cost of housing. So let me just show you that here. I'm going to take the private rented sector, where overall this has been most significant. Take an example of 3-bed properties and families deemed entitled to those. And I'm going to start the story in 2012. So actually, this is already just after some pretty big cuts to housing benefit. But I'm going to start the story here because that's the last time when there was an explicit link between the amount of housing benefit you could claim and the actual level of rents in your local area. So specifically, the housing benefit cap that applied to you was equal to the 30th percentile of local rents. In other words, wherever you lived in the country, you were somewhere on that 45-degree line. So let's take the example of someone in Greater Liverpool. The 30th percentile of rents there was about £120 a week, and so they could claim that much in housing benefit. Reading was a higher rent area, just over £200 a week, but you could claim that much in housing benefit. The only exceptions to this were a few areas in London, which I've brought up with dots here. They weren't on the 45-degree line because they were affected by overall national caps of £340 per week. I've left central London off this graph completely because it's so off the scale that you can't see what's going on in the rest of the country. So what happened after 2012-13? Well, we stopped linking housing benefit caps to actual housing costs. We increased them, first of all, by the CPI, which is also the longer-run intention going forward, and then by 1% per year, and then by 0% per year during the recent benefits freeze. So what's happened? Housing benefit support has fallen behind the cost of housing. This is the picture for all of the relevant localities in England in 2016-17. And we wind forward another 3 years, and we see, again, housing benefit falling further and further behind the cost of housing. So this really does raise the question of whether this is sustainable. If these dots move ever further south as rents increase, then low-income households are being asked to pay more and more of the burden of higher housing costs. It also leads to some pretty anomalous situations between people living in different areas as well. So to take an example of people living in the Cherwell Valley in Oxfordshire versus Cambridge. So back in 2012-13, rents were higher in the Cherwell Valley than in Cambridge. And because since then we haven't allowed housing benefit to change in line with rents, you can still claim more housing benefit in the Cherwell Valley than you can in Cambridge. But Cambridge has seen much, much faster rent growth since 2012. It's actually far more expensive now to rent in Cambridge than the Cherwell Valley. So housing costs more, but you can claim less support for it. So the particular way in this is being done is certainly creating some pretty anomalous situations. But more generally, I think you have to question whether this is really sustainable to break this link in this way. And in fact, whether it's coherent to have a system of support for housing costs that bears no relation to the cost of housing. So, challenge 3, the third and final challenge. Just about got time to talk about incapacity and disability. The first way I want to introduce this one is to ask you to contrast all of the stories we hear about pretty regularly of what sound like real injustices in some cases, the difficulties faced by those trying to get into the system and those living within it, with the fact that that's all happening at a time when we're spending massively more on these benefits than we were just a few years ago. So I'll show you that here. This shows you for working age spending on 2 groups of benefits, incapacity and disability benefits, what happened to spending over a 6-year period from 2010. Okay, so the incapacity benefits are the ones that you can claim if you're out of work, if your health is deemed to limit your ability to work. disability benefits are the benefits that you can get irrespective of work status, essentially if your health is deemed to give you extra costs of living. And first of all, to look at what was expected to happen to spending in these two cases, back in the 2012 autumn statement by the OBR, incapacity benefit spending was expected to fall by about a quarter, and disability benefit spending was also expected to fall slightly. And in both cases, key here were the fact that we were reforming these benefits, essentially reassessing people's health in a different way. And it was expected that fewer people would be deemed to be eligible for them, and fewer people would be deemed to be getting higher rates, to be eligible for higher rates. What's actually happened, rather than falling dramatically, incapacity benefit spending has risen a bit, and rather than falling a bit, disability benefit spending has massively increased, 50% in a 6-year period. Okay, and I said largely this is because those reforms have turned out to have completely different impacts to what was expected. But my broader point here is that if we're hearing about all the difficulties that we're hearing about at a time when spending is rising rapidly, that suggests either huge underlying pressures on the system or incredible difficulty identifying who should get help and how best to get it to them, and probably some combination of the two. To get a little bit more specific, finally, there are two key ways I want to show you in which the nature of the problem has changed. It's the moving target, which probably makes it even more difficult to deal with. So this is showing you the proportion of the population on incapacity benefits over time for two groups. Broadly speaking, the lower educated young group and a higher educated older group. So back in the late 1990s, older age was the key predictor of being on one of these benefits. So you were much more likely to be on them if you're older and high educated than if you're younger and low educated. If we wind that forward, what we've seen is a pretty much continual reversal of that pattern. So this means two things. First of all, we have a system which used to largely support people towards the end of working life in the period before they could start claiming their pension, and it's now supporting large numbers of people in their 20s and 30s. And in addition to that, education has become a really key predictor of whether you're on these benefits. So it's a group that increasingly looks like they face big challenges in the labour market over and above just their own poor health. And lastly, and probably related to some of the trends you've just seen, is the changes in the nature of the problems that people have. So this shows you the almost continual rise in the proportion of incapacity benefit claimants that are there because their main health condition at the start of their claim is a mental or behavioural one. It's now more than half of all of these cases. So there are real, and it seems pretty clear that we are struggling in some cases even to know how to assess these people's health, never mind how best to help and support them. So those are my three big challenges. There are obviously lots more, but that's a starter for 10. I want to just leave you with one broader point. I'm sure this has been occurring to you, kind of hope it has been occurring to you at various points, which is that obviously in all of these cases, the benefit system would have a much easier job if we could do better at solving the underlying problem, right? Whether it's low pay or cost of housing or ill health and the employment prospects of people in ill health. But that's not an accident. Welfare is in large part a patch, a £100 billion patch currently that we are applying to problems that we haven't yet found a deeper or better way of addressing. So I'll leave you with that point as we move into discussion.
Well, thanks ever so much for that, Rob. The benefits is a good sort of one for us to start these discussions on, actually, because I think exactly as Rob described, it shines a light on some of the big problems that we face from an economic and social point of view more generally. I mean, what Rob was essentially talking about was low pay, high housing costs, and particularly for those with low education, increasing levels of ill health and particularly mental ill health. So in a sense, we are focusing right on some of the biggest challenges that we're facing economically and socially going forward, and then thinking about how do you construct a welfare system on top of that, which both leaves people adequately well off and provides them with the leg up that they may need. And of course, that is a very difficult thing to do. What Rob very cleverly avoided saying very much at all about was the thing which actually probably is absolutely at top of mind when we think about the future of the benefit system, though, which is universal credit. And in a sense, that clearly encapsulates a lot of the trade-offs, a lot of the issues that we've been talking about. So I'm delighted that David Freud is here with us to fill that gap. Of course, David was the minister responsible for a long period for developing policy on universal credit. So Lord Freud, I wonder if you could perhaps sort of start by reflecting on where you think we've got with that, what the challenges, what we've learned from the challenges there, and also what the opportunities are within it to begin to fix some of the issues that Rob was describing.
I'm going to make a heroic assumption when I start, and that is that some of the cuts that we saw in 2015 in the benefit system, the very substantial cuts, will continue to be reversed, as they've started to be, and that we'll end up with a workable benefit system along the lines as originally designed. And also the second assumption is that it's going to happen more or less to time, so that we've got it introduced effectively 2022, 23, that kind of period. And I just wanted to look at the opportunity that represents. So in a few years, you've got a brand new system which is, its key element is its flexibility. And unlike other benefits, unlike other countries, we're not talking about lots of different benefits which effectively pigeonhole people in particular roles. You have a self-employed benefit and an employed benefit, or a disabled benefit, and so on. This benefit encapsulates everyone. And it was quite interesting. I spent quite a long time, it seems a little bit odd to say this with Brexit looming, but I spent quite a lot of time with the EU Commissioner, Marianne Thyssen, on this. And that was the thing that appealed to the Commission. Because people change. They go from being healthy to unhealthy. They go from being employed to self-employed. They go from being single to doubles, to couples. So if you just lock them into something, it makes life pretty tough. And I think it's particularly liberating, universal credit, for the disabled, because what it allows them to do is, instead of being in a category which says if you earn, I think it's more than £102 a week, bang, you're off it and you're on your own. And that's incredibly invidious for people with intermittent conditions. You could work particularly well for 3 months and maybe a very highly paid programmer or something, and then your condition comes back and you have to stop. You're too frightened to take the job for 3 months because you're risking your whole benefit structure. So in that sense, what it does is it does get rid of the welfare trap. If you're on welfare, you can get out of it. So let me just go through the 3 big opportunities that I think stand out. The first is how best to help the most vulnerable. And amazingly, we know how to do that and haven't really done it. What you need to do is to get all the services that they need in one place, because the most vulnerable have, almost by definition, multiple issues, and they need to be dealt with coherently. And so, you might take someone, for instance, who's got inadequate skills. Rob was talking about that as a major problem. Mental health problems are often associated, and maybe homelessness. So you have to fix all 3. And what we do in this country is we tend to spend an absolute fortune on each individual component, but then we don't stick them together. And I was very struck when I saw the story of Henry Willink, the wartime Minister for Homelessness, or for the homeless. And his conclusion was, get these services in one place. And indeed, we've had a huge number of experiments with it. I mean, Total Place is one. And now we've got a nascent structure where DWP works with the local authorities, which is called Universal Support. And DWP is now moved into, it's something under 100, probably 80 hubs run by local authorities, and starting to pull these services together, whether they're state-run or whether they're privately, like Citizens Advice. That hub allows all these different groups to understand how they can work together. And it needs three things. It needs the hub, it needs a caseworker to push people around the system appropriately, and it needs efficient data. And indeed, there's an SI on data sharing, which statutory instrument on data sharing, which the DWP has got and can implement after it does some more consultation. So that's one. The second opportunity is to optimize the system. We've now got, when we have universal credit in place, have an enormous amount of information about how people respond. And we have got the ability to test various things, what is the most efficient rate, what is the best taper rate, and so on and so forth. And that means that we've got a system that we can, over the years, optimize.
Can I ask, do you think that DWP will actually experiment on that?
I think they will.
Really evaluate what works?
The DWP does the most enormous amount of piloting anyway. It's just extremely expensive because you have to track everyone down almost individually. With universal credit, where you know what people are doing, because you can see what they're doing on a monthly basis, you can actually semi-automate all of that research, and you can do an enormous amount more. So I think they'll grab that opportunity with both hands. But the third thing, that's picking up one of Rob's points on the low-income workers who are now in the same system. The only way to help people raise income, I mean, you can raise a whip and make them work more hours, but the real way to do it is to get their skills levels up. And for some reason, we have separated skills, the skills agenda in this country away from the employment agenda. They've been in separate, not always, actually. I think 15 years ago they were in the same place. But this is an opportunity to pull it together. And what we do know is that skills has an impact when people are in work. It doesn't actually do much for you when people are out of work. Once they're in work, it has got an impact. And if we can pull the skills agenda into the low-paid agenda effectively, that might be the answer to one of Rob's key challenges of how do we get people paid more, and indeed how do we improve the productivity that we have in this country.
Brilliant. So that's a great prospectus for the future, and gives us some reason for optimism. But I mean, John, in your sort of analysis of the actual current impact of universal credit, how well does that chime with where Lord Freud is?
I think it's very difficult to be talking about universal credit as it's running at the moment in terms of what it might look like in 2023 in terms of optimizing a system when we're facing the problems that we do at the moment that are partly the result of the cuts, which David had nothing to do with, I'm sure, because since the 2015 budget, and which illustrate, I think, one fundamental thing that IFS has talked about throughout its history, which is that if you're doing tax reform or benefit reform, where there are going to be gainers and losers, it's vastly easier to do that at a time when you're putting more resources into the system than at a time when resources are being taken out of the system. But I think the other thing it illustrates is the importance of micro-level design around how payments are made. And I think it's very easy as economists for us to draw nice diagrams showing what people's gross income looks like and what their net income looks like, without thinking about how movements over time work. And there are lots of ways one could talk about that, but I think the most important thing for universal credit that's causing the greatest hardship at the moment is the assumption that the normal world is one where you're paid monthly in arrears, and that you're dealing with a problem of what happens if you lose your job or your main source of income. In that situation, it seems reasonable to set up, if I lost my job, if LSE sacked me as a result of what I say this evening, I will...
It's going to get exciting.
I'll get my paycheck on Thursday, and then I'll have a month and I could survive. Even without any other savings, I could survive for 5 or 6 weeks. That's not the world that most people live in. I think there are most people that are dealing with universal credit live in, and I think that's caused enormous problems. And it's happened for an interesting combination of reasons. One was an ideological reason, which was the idea that people had been in a world that was not like the real world of work, where people were having their benefits paid weekly or fortnightly, and that wasn't really what the world was going to be like, and they shouldn't be, in a way, mollycoddled like that. A second was an opportunity, which was that the previous tax credit system had been bedeviled by the philosophy that this was like income tax, and therefore not stigmatized, which is a huge advantage of the tax credit system, but therefore part of the idea that you adjusted everything after the end of the year to make sure that it was right in the way that our income tax is supposed to be adjusted at the end of the year to make sure that it eventually was right. And that caused all sorts of movements up and down inexplicably in terms of what people got. The opportunity was HMRC collecting information from employers on a monthly basis so that you could get that right, you could get the payments right first time through real-time information. And I think that those two things went together to say, well, let's do this on a monthly basis, get it right by doing it in arrears. But also, more cynically, and I wouldn't expect David to respond to this, but it did produce a cash flow benefit to government. By paying in arrears as people come in, government will have shifted an amount of spending from one financial year to the next financial year. But the corollary of that is that that cash flow loss has been visited on people who are claiming universal credit. They have to spread their money out longer, they have to use up their ability to rely on family and friends, they run into rent arrears. I've seen what housing associations are having to do, social landlords are having to do to try and cope with the rise in rent arrears. And it's pushed people into a combination of hardship and debt. And that's happened as a result of that micro-level design decision, which I think Rob mentioned some of the ways in which you've been thinking about how people are affected by benefit and social security over their whole lifetimes. I think as well as that, which is really important, thinking about these micro-level dynamics and trying to get that right in a way that I don't think the advance payments yet get right, because they're alone, and you can get more money up front now, and Amber Rudd's been pushing more in that direction, but it still means a reduction in your benefit over the next 12 months or 15 months, as it will be. You're going to be 7 or 8% poorer in a system that is, because of the cuts and the freezes, becoming less generous. So we've got, in a way, from where we're starting from at the moment, some things that we didn't need to get wrong.
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to universal credit when we get questions from the audience. I suppose one of the things I worry about universal credit is a bit like Brexit. It just means that nothing else is getting thought about in the benefit system. But Liz, one of the big things that Rob was saying is there's been this very big increase in spending and numbers of people on incapacity and disability benefits at the same time as we continually see these awful stories of people who are clearly extremely sick and sometimes at death's door who are not being told they're not eligible for these benefits. And you have this extraordinary trade-off, as it were, when you kind of get us bean counters looking at it and say, well, look, there's all this money being spent, all these people on it, and then you kind of look at the real world and say, well, there are some people who are being treated awfully by the system. So I'm inclined to ask, so what's the answer? But I mean, you've obviously been working with this system for a long time. So what are your reflections on sort of why we're seeing the trends that we have and how we can move to a world which is sort of both sustainable and more human?
Yes, I should probably just say I'm not going to comment as a member of the Social Security Advisory Committee, just they might not agree with me. So it seems to me that, and anybody here who is a disabled person or works with disabled people will know that people often feel very powerless. You know, it may be that you're one of those young people who's got low education and skills that Lord Freud was talking about. It may be that you've just acquired an impairment at some point during your working life, which has had a fairly catastrophic impact in all sorts of ways, and you face all kinds of barriers. So I think the first thing is that you want a system that enables people to get a bit more power back and feel that you can start taking a bit more control of your life. And I think that we're not there. So, for example, I think that there's mounting evidence that the way conditionality and sanctions have been applied, with disabled people at least, has in some respects been counterproductive. So, you know, we've seen the work from the Behavioural Insights team that says that, you know, actually, if you don't have the bandwidth because you're worrying about money, you're worrying about whether you're going to be able to, you know, to pay the rent or to buy food and stuff, that in that state of mind, you are not able to make good decisions about whether you're going to try work or something like that. So, so much policy attention has been focused on trying to incentivize or disincentivize the individuals, the disabled people, much less on either other parts of the system, like skills. I would very much agree with David Freud on that, you know, actually, if you're not skilled for the world of work, what chance have you got? But also on the world of work. I mean, yesterday in the Daily Telegraph, I don't know if anybody saw it, there was a big piece on all the people who've succeeded doing working flexibly, working part-time, working flexible hours and so on. But actually that whole movement hasn't touched very much on people living with health conditions who get stuck in very, very low-paid work or they're not in work at all. So actually, if we made the workplace fit for people rather than focusing so much on is the person fit for work, we might open up more employment opportunities and better employment opportunities in such a way that, at least in terms of the people who are on the incapacity benefits, you might start to see a shift. I think in other words, that we've had a set of incentives and so on that haven't worked to encourage disabled people to move out of incapacity benefits into work. And I mean, I could say something about the disability benefits like personal independence payment as well. But I mean, what I think we need is to view social security not in terms of sort of looking after vulnerable people who are kind of other. But firstly, of course, all of us can, you know, most of us, as Rob said, will need social security, will need working age benefits at some point. But also the purpose needs to be about enabling people to participate. You know, so disabled people are much less likely to have educational qualifications, less likely to participate in things like leisure and sport, and more likely to be socially isolated. So the benefit system, alongside the social care system, the education system, and health and so on, should be acting together to give people some of that power. Instead of which, I think people are assessed to distraction. You go through so many different assessments for your personal budget in social care, your personal health budget, your PIP, your work capability, you know, on and on and on and on. So I think there's a lot that could be done by bringing some of that together so people have more say over, well, these are the resources I've got. I've got some access to work support. I've got PIP, which will mean I can have a mobility car or whatever it is, and that can make sense for my life. So I don't know that answers the trends question, but it's a different way of, or it's a way of viewing social security for a purpose, which is about what the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities talks about, the right to live independently and participate and be included in the community. And that's what it should be trying to do.
And I think that's very consonant, actually, with what David was saying about the need for this to be treated as a whole, and for the person to be treated as a whole when they're accessing different things rather than being put into different slots. mean, it's also interesting what you say about the role of the employer, because I think one of the things that Rob said quite quickly when he was talking is some of the work that we've done at the IFS really does show the terrible toll that working part-time has on your future earnings. So essentially we've done lots of very careful work on this, and essentially we tend to expect people, as they do more work and get experience, to see their wages rise over time, and indeed particularly for people with reasonable levels of education, that's what you do see. But if they're working part-time, that just stops. Essentially, you get no benefit from working an extra year or an extra 5 years part-time where you would if you were working full-time. And that's clearly related to organisation within the workplace. And one of the things that we can't really get into this evening, but one of the things the social security system has to deal with is the fact that we have a workplace which doesn't work well for a lot of people working, whether because they've got disabilities or because they're working part-time or because they're working flexibly. Again, sort of zooming even further out, I mean, John, one of the first charts that Rob showed was this remarkable change in the structure of the benefit system over the last 30 or 40 years, from one which, still had a significant sort of universal and social insurance element a while ago, which is now really focused on means testing. So as Rob said, we've got a bunch of trade-offs that choices we have to make, and we have consistently made the same choice over time. Different governments have made the same choice, quite understandably, which is at any moment in time you want to focus the money where it's most needed, and that means more means testing. I mean, do you think that has been the right set of decisions? Do you think that's a set of decisions which we are now stuck with because we can't move away from that, or do you think we really ought to be looking at a big move away? I
think those two questions don't necessarily, those two answers don't necessarily go the same way. In that Beveridge proposed the contributory system back in 1942 for perfectly good reasons. A lot of that was to do with public acceptability of the system. Benefit in return for contributions is what the people of Britain want. And we've certainly seen the problems of a system that is not seen as a return on your contributions as we've moved further and further towards it in two ways in particular. One is the stigma attached to the system, and therefore the difficulty in supporting its level and its generosity, as it's seen as being about them and not about us. And the other is a way in which the system fails to do what it's supposed to do, sort of type 1 targeting error, that people who are supposed to be being helped don't claim. They don't claim all the benefits that they're entitled to. And one of the, I think, things we will learn about universal credit, the big plus side of universal credit, may be that people who are getting some of the benefits which they're entitled to may end up getting all of them, rather than missing out on some of them. But some of the reasons why they're not claiming may be to do with stigma, and one of the big risks in universal credit is that the whole system will now be seen as being means tested in that way. So Beveridge had good arguments. Many continental European countries, and I know we're not like the rest of Europe, still think that is a good way to run systems. But we haven't. From the very beginning, we did not set contributory benefits high enough to carry people clear of what was then national assistance. And then over time, I think it's been for different reasons that governments of the left and right, sometimes both at the same time, have reduced the scope of contributory benefits. One was the point you made, which is that if you've got an incredibly scarce amount of money, are you going to give it to people who don't quite really need it, but just happen to have contributed in the past, as opposed to the people who've got the least resources today? That pushes you, if you're not thinking of the long-term dynamics of that, how much tax people are prepared to pay or the contributions they're prepared to pay, towards a means-tested system. But equally, I think the contributory system was undermined on the left, because a system that was contributory based on people's working record excluded a lot of people, particularly women, but also young people, but also people who had patchy employment records for all sorts of reasons. And we brought in more and more credits. So we're not talking about pensions tonight, but particularly towards pensions, but also we wanted people to get support because of their needs today, rather than because of their contributions in the past. So it's been squeezed from both sides. And in answer, so not necessarily a good idea that it evolved like that, and I think there were some dynamics in terms of what we're prepared to put into the system that follow from that. But I see I see very little way that we're going to get out of that, having got ourselves into that situation. The proposals once and there are people, well, he's in the audience, but people like Frank Field would argue that we have to go back to that system, but I don't see that occurring, not from where we are now.
As I say, we are going to be covering tax, pensions, education, and sort of the world, the future of the state in things later through the year. If you look at your lovely little booklet here, there's more information about the IFS. There's even information about how you can support us through membership, should you so desire. We still want that from you. Please come along to future events. Please come and speak to us later. There are now drinks through towards the library. Do come and enjoy yourselves even more than you've enjoyed the last hour and a half. Thank you very much.